Welcome back to another edition of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm Chrissy Heim, and today we're in Dayton, Ohio at Carillon Historical Park with Steve Grismer and Alex Heckman. Today we're going to talk about this exhibit here at the park, and we're going to start with you, Steve.
Okay.
What is the history of Dayton Police Historical Society?
Well, the Dayton Police History Foundation was chartered by the state of Ohio on January 1st, 2010. It's a private, nonprofit, 501c3 charitable organization. It's strictly dedicated to the preservation of local law enforcement history, and we do that in a variety of ways. We give presentations throughout the community, we collect police historical artifacts, and we do our best to preserve them. We provide written accounts on local law enforcement to newspapers and periodicals. We've even published 3 books, one of which I'm going to be talking about a little later. But best of all, we take people from the present to the past by creating temporary exhibits, one of which is here at Carillon Historical Park.
So Alex, what can you tell us about this impressive exhibit?
Well, this exhibit is in the context of the broader Carillon Historical Park. So we have a 65-acre campus here in Dayton, Ohio, and we're dedicated to telling the history of not just Dayton, but how has Dayton made a mark on the world. So the centerpiece, the namesake, if you will, of the historical park is a 151-foot tall bell tower known as the Deeds Carillon. That marks the entrance to the 65-acre campus, which has over 35 different historical buildings and structures. Central among them is the Wright Brothers National Museum. So we have people that come from all around the country and literally all across the globe every year to see the Wright Brothers National Museum, where we have more original Wright Brothers artifacts on exhibit than anywhere else in the world. In addition to that, we have train and trolley cars people can walk through. We have Dayton's oldest building. We have an extensive collection of operational 1920s, 1930s printing equipment, a collection of Dayton-made automobiles, and the list goes on and on and on. And so we are so pleased whenever we can work with another group, in this case the Dayton Police History Foundation, to help bring some of these amazing stories to life.
Well, Alex, we're currently in an exhibit called Bootleggers, Bandits, and Badges. What can you tell us about this exhibit?
So this is a fantastic exhibit. We, several years ago, were in conversations with the Dayton Police History Foundation, and we said, here we have an approaching anniversary of the dawn of Prohibition, this gangster era, this era that has so much romanticism associated with it, all the blood and guts, the movies, the TV shows. There's a real fascination with that time period, and so we thought, why don't we take a fresh perspective, a fresh look at what was the Prohibition era like in Dayton, Ohio specifically. So we were then on a journey to build a temporary exhibit here.
Steve, how did this exhibit come to be?
Well, as Alex said, on a regular basis, Carillon Park creates temporary exhibits inside the Quintner Family Exhibition Gallery, which is where we're sitting today. And often they're proposed by outside groups. The 100th anniversary of the Volstead Act and Prohibition was forthcoming, and so Dayton Police History expressed an interest in telling the story of law enforcement to the visitors here at Carillon Historical Park. We were willing to invest $60,000, thanks to generous donors that we have, to bring the accomplished history of policing at that time in our U.S. past, specifically in our U.S. past at that time, to the visitors at Carillon Historical Park.
So Alex, is this exhibit only focused on the Prohibition era?
Well, while it primarily focuses on the Prohibition era, we couldn't talk about Prohibition in Dayton or anywhere else in a vacuum, and so it really has 3 distinct elements. We talk about the temperance movement in Dayton and nationally, and that went on for decades and decades, the effort to outlaw the sale and production and consumption of alcohol. That then leads us into the main thrust of the exhibit, which is indeed about the Prohibition era itself, but then from there it transitions into the Great Depression and all of that building period of anger and desperation and lawlessness and everything that compounds. And so it really gives people a good perspective on a snapshot of the social history of Dayton and what was it like between, say, the mid-19th century temperance movement all the way through the end of the Great Depression. But again, the real emphasis though on, of course, Prohibition itself.
So Steve, broadly, what was it from these historical periods that were so important to law enforcement?
Well, during the 19th century and the early years of the Temperance Crusade, particularly after the Civil War, law enforcement was very, very primitive. It went from having single law enforcement officials, whether they were town marshals or constables, to becoming organized municipal police departments. And in Dayton, that happened in 1867, so over 155 years ago. The Dayton Metropolitan Police Force was formed, was the third to form in the state of Ohio after Cincinnati in 1858 and Cleveland in 1866. So that's the first section of our exhibit. The Prohibition era, the middle gallery section, is when there was an awakening for law enforcement. Surging crime with automatic weapons and high-powered automobiles were creating havoc, not only for Dayton police officers, but for police officers nationwide. And then the police experienced its greatest evolution as a profession, arguably, during the Great Depression, and that's our last gallery exhibit.
Alex, the Prohibition era is the midpoint of this exhibit. Can you tell us how that relates to the nexus of the other two eras?
Yes, it's a really interesting question. When you think about Prohibition and all the great and well-intentioned efforts people had, locally and nationally, you could look at problems in Dayton, and again, like many Midwestern cities and cities across the country, where a man, for example, in this day and age with one income household, a man would work at a factory job or work in a mill and receive his pay and unfortunately drink away half of it or more at the local saloon. It was destroying kind of the fabric of family lives. It was really straining society overall. So it's easy to understand in some respects why the temperance movement was so organized and why it was primarily an effort of women and of ministers working together to fix this problem. So then the pendulum, though, swings, and they're successful. After decades and decades of effort, they're successful in changing the U.S. Constitution to outlaw the sale and production and consumption of alcohol. Well, with that, now what you end up having, though, just to use Dayton, Ohio as one example, you had about 230, give or take, saloons, neighborhood bars in Dayton, city limits of Dayton, prior to the advent of Prohibition. At the height of the Prohibition era, these numbers can be difficult sometimes to pin down, but the estimates are that it was somewhere around 750 of these illegal bootleg operations, these speakeasies that we've all heard of or thought of. And so you think about that, you go from 230 neighborhood bars, now there's 750 places, you know, around the city where people can go and party and drink alcohol, and it's all unregulated, and there's little awareness as to who's supposed to be there and not be there. You know, you lose that kind of that neighborhood bar type feel to it. Now, all of the people who maybe had been involved in this temperance era selling alcohol are now outlaws, you know, and so it all builds upon, you know, piece after piece. And it's just like what Steve was talking about. You can track the rise of professional policing and the methods and the materials that they're using to combat the gangsters and all the lawlessness. But it was almost like a ever-increasing battle back and forth. So then you talk about a nexus with Prohibition. So then the trailing end of this exhibit really deals with what happens next. So you go from Prohibition and all the trouble and all of the drama that's involved with it. Well, layered on top of that now is the worst economic calamity that the nation had ever faced, that the globe had ever faced. And so that just compounds everything so much more, and the violence increases, you know, exponentially above what it had already been in the 1920s. And so by the time that, you know, the Hoover administration's winding down, the Roosevelt administration's winding up, everybody realized something's got to change. And so that ends up being the end of the Prohibition era, and then kind of moving into a new era, you know, by the end of the Great Depression, World War II and beyond. So sort of a long-winded answer for you, but hope that helps explain a little bit about the causes and effects.
Right. Steve, what can you tell us about the temperance era and as it relates to Prohibition in the Dayton, Ohio area?
Well, even though the movement had been around for 50 years, as Alex had mentioned, the Women's Christian Temperance Crusade was born in Hillsborough, Ohio in December of 1873 when it closed all of that town's saloons. So then they decided, well, let's hit a bigger target. And they decided to come to a major U.S. city, and that happened to be Dayton, Ohio, with its 250 to 350 saloons. And that was a fact that was mentioned in Ken Burns' documentary, Prohibition. The women were here in February of 1874 throughout March and into April of that year. And they had 200 praying women. They would divide into bands of 22 ladies, and they would go visit the local taverns, and they would pray for the imbibing men's souls. Well, as you can imagine, the saloon keepers didn't really appreciate it a whole lot, so they would offer free beer to their male patrons if they would come when the women would show. And so that led to confrontations. The men would cuss and throw food at the women. They'd even brandish knives and guns at these prayerful women standing outside on a mission. These confrontations made the national press, and there were even a series of 4 newspaper articles in the New York Times about what was happening in Dayton. It was particularly challenging to a really young police department at that time. Locally, the crusade didn't find success in closing saloons in the Gem City, and while it failed in Dayton, 45 years later, that movement led to Prohibition.
So then, Alex, what can you tell us about the Prohibition era as it relates to Dayton, Ohio?
So I think there are some interesting things specific to Dayton. So in some respects, Dayton is very similar to other cities and to nationwide trends, but then there are also some very specific things about this Prohibition era, this Roaring 20s era in Dayton, Ohio. So by the 1920s, Dayton was a growing major industrial powerhouse in the country. We had put our mark on the world with the Wright brothers and the inauguration of the successful airplane flights. So even by the 1920s, we were known as Air City as one of our monikers. Of course, we're known as the Gem City. But what is specifically happening in Dayton now with Prohibition is that there had been in the ramp up to World War I, large numbers of African Americans that had come up north as part of the Great Migration North to work factory jobs for World War I. At the same time, we also had large numbers of Appalachian people coming from Kentucky and West Virginia and points farther south and east. See the convergence of that going on in terms of society. And so one of the unfortunate elements of Dayton's past is that we had a really heavy Ku Klux Klan presence in Dayton. At one point they said there were probably somewhere around 15,000 Klansmen in the county alone. And so you have, again, all these differing levels of social climate issues. You have issues with racial tensions. You have a growing industrial city, as I mentioned. So all these things are layered on top of each other. The 20s also sees the new role for women in Dayton and across the country, with women securing the right to vote. So the social dynamics are in continual flux and are really dynamic, you could say, throughout the 1920s. And so again, adding that level of prohibition of alcohol on top of it, it just adds one more layer to this stack. And so those are all aspects of it, I think. It's challenging today for people living in the 21st century to realize how much of a growing city Dayton was as well in the 1920s. So it really was boom time for the city of Dayton and for the surrounding area. If you look at numbers of houses built, for example, between 1920 and 1930, it's larger than it had been in any decade prior to that. So it really was a growing, booming, bustling city. And so Prohibition just kind of adds a fascinating color to that whole thing.
So Steve, how does that relate then to law enforcement in Dayton?
Well, it was Prohibition, and the enforcement of Prohibition was fairly successful in Dayton from 1921 to 1928 until the will of the general public and the politicians began to wane. We recount a number of stories in our exhibit about bootlegging operations and arrest. George Remus, the king of bootleggers, he had a network that supplied liquor, not only illegal liquor, not only to Dayton, but to towns throughout the Midwest, including Al Capone's Chicago mob. They say that Al Capone would not have been the mob boss that he was had it not been for George Remus. But Remus was incarcerated in the Montgomery County Jail here in Dayton on bootlegging charges. There were other bootleggers in the Dayton area, including the, I would call him the vicious, notorious gangster. He was a killer, Bob Zwick, who was called the Fox of Gangland. And then there was some local graft, but Dayton Police Chief Rudy Wurstner, who would become the nation's Dean of Police Chiefs in 1935, he effectively kept a lid on corruption here in Dayton. Even though we had notorious gangsters traveling in and out of the city, there were no mob bosses here like Al Capone in Chicago. Yet for Dayton police officers, there were many gun battles during the Roaring '20s. In 1927 alone, 5 Dayton lawmen were tragically shot and killed in 5 separate incidents in just a mere 5-month period of time. But finally, the under-equipped policemen began to receive the tools that they needed. Incredibly, it was during the Great Depression, to deal with the likes of John Dillinger and later Bugs Moran.
Now, you mentioned John Dillinger. What was his connection to Dayton?
Well, many people have heard that John Dillinger had a girlfriend here, so he came to Dayton, he was arrested in Dayton, and then transferred somewhere else. That other place happened to be the Allen County Jail in Lima, Ohio. But the story of John Dillinger and Dayton, Ohio is far, far more involved, as related in a book that we published. The first bank that Dillinger ever held up was the New Carlisle National Bank in neighboring Clark County. And that crime is really where the local story begins. And to be quite frank, it's where the national story of John Dillinger begins. Dillinger was in Dayton, by my count, as many as 8 times. He may have been here more, but I know that he was here in May, June, July, August, and September of 1933. The elusive fugitive was captured by police only twice during his entire criminal career. And the first time was in Dayton by Dayton police detectives on September 22nd, 1933. His face, John Dillinger's face, became famous nationwide because of mugshots that were taken by the Dayton Police Bureau of Identification and distributed to law enforcement agencies throughout the country and circulated by the national press.
Alex, did the crash of the stock market in the Great Depression affect Dayton differently than it affected other cities nationwide?
Well, what I would say to that is that Dayton was a major industrial city. We were about the 43rd in terms of size and population by the time the stock market crashes. And so many of these trends that we see nationwide, many of the things that people learn about in their history textbooks when they're in school, certainly tracks along with what happens in Dayton, Ohio. The difference, I would say, is that we had perhaps more of a group of philanthropic people in Dayton that had set up a private community foundation, and there seemed to be more of an effort with that and with the religious groups and churches and so forth in Dayton to perhaps provide more of a safety net than would be found in some areas in some parts of the country. But having said that, it was still a desperate time in Dayton, Ohio, and I think one of the factors in this Bootleggers, Bandits, and Badges exhibit that is so fascinating is that my colleague here, Steve, did a lot of original research for this exhibit, and what we really determined was that this Great Depression, the stock market crashing, only opened the floodgates even further for the lawlessness and the violence. And prior to the exhibit being put together, most of Dayton's professional history community here with the Dayton History Organization and other affiliated historical societies, if you had asked most of those folks before this exhibit was put together, was there much of an organized crime presence in Dayton in the 1920s? The answer probably would have been like no, or it would have been, I really don't know. And so again, a credit to Steve for having put this together to really determine that yes, in fact, Dayton did have its problems with organized crime. The gangster era that you might think about with Chicago and New York and Washington, D.C. had an entire aspect and an entire element of it happening here. So again, the hope is as people go through this exhibit, they learn about Dayton-specific information, temperance, prohibitions, Great Depression, gangster era, but that they're learning those unique Dayton stories in the context of what was happening nationwide. So it's a little bit of, again, to use that word layered, it's a little bit of a layered answer, but we certainly had trend lines that mirrored nationwide experiences, but we also had some unique Dayton experiences as well.
So Steve, how did the police deal with bank robbers and rising crime through all of this?
Well, unlike the 1920s, the growing crime rate and public fear arguably led to the greatest transformation in law enforcement during the Great Depression. Investments were made into high-capacity weapons, into patrol cars with one-way radios, into uniforms that were better suited for battle with their action-ready gun belts. The bank robberies seemed to be more frequent than not. It was a major concern for local financial institutions that collaborated with law enforcement to ensure that their bank alarms were wired directly into police headquarters. The banks purchased a customized Cadillac V8 that was dubbed the Bank Flyer. As a matter of fact, it was customized by the same company in Cincinnati that customized two of Al Capone's Cadillacs. But that particular Bank Flyer, it had a reinforced front bumper, a steel-covered radiator, impenetrable tires, bulletproof windshield, and it had special racks built inside to hold Tommy guns, shotguns, Winchesters, gas grenades, and just a whole assortment of weapons. It was donated to the Dayton Police Department by the banks specifically to respond to hold-up alarms.
No conflict of interest there between arming both of those.
No.
Wonder who paid more for their better.
Yeah.
So you mentioned weapons, and there are a number on display here. What all do we have?
I mean, as Steve is pointing out, this time period becomes just an escalation of violence from the bad guys and from the police. And so central to this exhibit, what we really built the entire exhibit around was what we knew we had a very special artifact. We have the actual handgun, a Colt Super 38, that John Dillinger, #1 most wanted man in America, #1 on the FBI's public enemy list, had on him when he was arrested in Dayton, Ohio by the Dayton Police Department. And so it was long in the custody of the Dayton Police Chief, Rudy Wurstner, the Dean of the nation's police chiefs. And we have placed it on exhibit here in the Bootleggers exhibit directly next to the weapon that Chief Wurstner had at that same time, just to show that glaring difference between what the lawmen were using and what the much more, very modern, even today in the 21st century, what looks to be a very powerful modern handgun that the outlaws were using. And so those two are certainly the centerpiece in terms of artifacts, sort of the must-see of this exhibit. But in addition to that, we have over a dozen weapons in an exhibit case, a display case showing weapons that were confiscated from criminals in Dayton during this gangster era. So we're talking about handguns and revolvers, we're talking about sawed-off shotguns, other sawed-off long guns, all displayed in a very impactful way, all in one case to just show a snapshot. You know, this is just some small percentage of all of the weapons that were taken off the streets by the Dayton police during this era. I think one of the fantastic things about history is when we look at how does it provide relevance to where we're living today. And so I think a lot of the trends, a lot of the conversations that people have in the 21st century, how successful is the war on drugs? What drugs should be outlawed? Which drugs should be completely legal? Which ones maybe could be decriminalized? And all those conversations and all those debates and all those things that happen, it's easy for people to go back and say, well, look what happened with prohibition. People that are pro or con on anywhere along those lines. And I think the same thing happens today when we think about some of these terrible situations that we've encountered across the country with lawlessness and gangs and organized crime that's still going on today. And it's a constant situation of upping the ante, you know, like what do the bad guys have? What do these negative criminal elements have? And what does our law enforcement team have? And how do you get that to a point where maybe it's more equitable or the police have more of a chance to fight off some of these elements?
So Steve, I saw one really interesting weapon that caught my eye when I first came in. Can you tell me about that one?
Well, Alex talked about one custom case we have here in the 1930s era. We have another custom case in the Prohibition era, and in that case is a 1921 Colt Thompson submachine gun that was requisitioned by the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office during the Prohibition period, specifically to deal with the surging crime that was happening in the greater Dayton area. So we're really proud to exhibit that particular gun.
So Steve, the name George Bugs Moran was mentioned earlier. What was his connection to Dayton?
Well, most people know that Bugs Moran was the chief gang rival of Al Capone during the Roaring 20s up in Chicago, and that he was the target for the 1929 St. Valentine's Day massacre. He happened to escape his own gangland execution because he was late for a bootlegger meeting in the garage. But 7 of his leadership, his gang members, were wiped out in that massacre. And so Moran, he wisely decided to take a lower profile, but that didn't stop him from continuing a life of crime throughout the Midwest, including committing some bank heists locally. He robbed a runner from Winter's Bank at 3rd and Broadway here in Dayton. In the end, he was taken into custody by Dayton police detectives. He was prosecuted and then convicted here in Montgomery County. He died in prison. So Dayton was the scene of the last crime that the infamous mobster Bugs Moran ever committed. But we had other notorious gangsters with links to Greater Dayton other than Moran and Remus and Zwick and Dillinger. 2 other public enemies, numbers 1, Al Karpus and Al Brady. They were up to no good in the city of Dayton. And Clyde Barrow, of Bonnie and Clyde fame, most people don't know. He was arrested at 23 miles south of Dayton for a robbery in Middletown. And John Dillinger's chief lieutenant, Charlie Makeley, he's from St. Mary's, Ohio, which is a community just north of Dayton at the top of the greater Miami Valley region. So people would be surprised at the number of gangsters that were rolling in and out of Dayton during the 1920s and the 1930s.
Alex, this exhibit is temporary, but it's been here since October of 2019. What does temporary mean?
That's a great question. You know, any museum of any size typically has what they think of as permanent exhibits and temporary exhibits. And that word temporary can mean different things to different people. When we inaugurated this exhibit, we had hoped that it would be a popular exhibit. It would relate to people, and people could have even some almost emotional reactions to some of the things that we were putting together. I think we have been very impressed by how well received this exhibit has been by the general public. It has really been an eye-opening exhibit for people. As some of the stories that we've mentioned today, this idea of organized crime, the idea of these famous, A-list gangsters being arrested in Dayton or connected to Dayton or the Dayton region in one way or another, all those things have played into it. So we have extended this exhibit twice, and the idea right now is that it will remain open through the end of 2023, and in the course of doing that, it will make it really one of our longest temporary exhibits that we've ever mounted and have executed here at the museum. Again, it's a relatively large footprint. It fills up this temporary exhibits gallery space that we have, and really feel like there are so many major elements to it, and so many artifacts that are either owned by Dayton History or that are on loan to us from other organizations, that really felt like it would be a great thing to do to have it here as long as we could have it here. And again, it wouldn't have been possible without the support of the Dayton Police History Foundation, who really funded the entire exhibit and did the lion's share of research on it and putting together all of the artifacts and pulling all of these different pieces together.
It sounds like there is a much larger story here.
Well, we like to think that there is a larger vision for Dayton Police History Foundation, and that even though this is the most ambitious project we put together to date, it's grander. Our vision is grander than Bootleggers, Bandits, and Badges. The story of Dayton law enforcement is one of high achievement on the local, state, national, and even international stages, from issuing the world's first speeding ticket in 1904 to being the first in the nation in 1940 to outfit an entire police fleet of patrol cars. here in Dayton, and that was at a time when President Franklin Roosevelt was in town from forming the International Police Bike Association in 1991. There's over 225 years of Dayton police history that we have to share, going all the way back to 1797. This exhibit, it covered about 75 of those years, and even not completely. And this exhibit serves as a tangible example of what the fuller story would hold. Viewers can learn more about what we have in store by going to our website, which is DaytonPoliceHistory.org, and they can learn more about the stories that are currently on display in this exhibit, in a book that we've written that expands on all of the stories that we mentioned here today, and that book is The Dean, Dillinger, and Dayton, Ohio, Legend, Lore, and Legacy. It's available at Amazon.com, but it's available here in the gift shop at Carillon Historical Park, and all proceeds from the sales of our book go to our efforts, the Dayton Police History Foundation. And so we invite the audience to come to Dayton, tour the exhibit, buy the book, but enjoy not only our exhibit, but the entire grounds here at Carillon Historical Park. It is just absolutely fascinating what they have, and there's such a rich history here in Dayton, Ohio. So everybody's invited. Come to Dayton.
Well, I'll definitely be coming back with my kids and grandkids. This has been an amazing trip. So glad I got to come and meet the both of you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That wraps it up for this edition of History in Your Own Backyard.